Hi, it's Dennis Daly. In Montreal, Canada, in Quebec, there is an incredible museum to the archaeological past and the architectural history of the city of Montreal. I thought you might enjoy going there. And then a surprise as we go to the Cathedral of Notre Dame, which actually left me speechless.
Of course, we have the presence of the Amerindians.
There is a wonderful museum in Montreal. It is the Museum of Architecture and History. And when the city of Montreal wanted to build the museum, they suddenly realized that much of the history is actually below ground level. The original walls and foundations for the city, for example. And so the museum is down and around and on top. Well, it's just a wonder to behold. Virginia Elliott was our tour guide as she took us through the beautiful underground museum in Montreal, Canada. Virginia, we are underneath a building, and I think the unique aspect of this to me, and many of my listeners realize that I love old things. I did a show once from an abandoned section of highway north of Los Angeles that hasn't been used since the 1920s, and every time I go to LA, I find it up in the mountains. And just like anything that's old, part of it is in pristine shape on the protected side of the mountain, and the other part's completely washed away. We are down at the level of the original footings and many of the walls in the very original part of Montreal. Could you, for those who have not been to Montreal, kind of put it in perspective as far as we're on the St. Lawrence River, and that the early settlements, by their very nature, were at the edge of the river?
Well, yes, Montreal is an island, a large island, and when the French came, they encountered Indians who had been living on the island for centuries or probably thousands of years, and the river being the highways of the time, people lived along the shores. In this particular spot, there was a small point of land between the St. Lawrence River and a smaller river, and the French decided to build a fort. Unfortunately, and I think a lot of people today know what floods are like, this was a major problem at the beginning of the settlement of the city, so they sought higher land. So where we're standing now is on a small rise about 20 feet above the St. Lawrence, and this is where the city was built.
I guess by its very nature, in archaeology, you're almost always going downward to look at things. You were using an analogy earlier about things being piled on top of each other, that just with the progression of time, we tend to build on our own rubble most of the time.
Anybody who has a desk cluttered with paper knows what archaeology is about. Your bills that you lose, you know you can go by the depth of paper on your desk. The oldest ones are going to be at the bottom, and that's exactly what archaeology is. You tend to build up over old ruins, you cover things over, you start over again, and so the archaeologist does exactly the opposite. He starts on today's street where we know what's there, we see it, it's modern, and as we go down through the soil, we go down through time as well.
Well, Virginia, let's walk around, and there's a family coming with a baby. You have an enormous number of people who come through here. It's difficult on radio to actually explain, but what you have done is to build a brand new building, much of it with wonderfully stark cement walls and high-tech metal works and railings, but actually to build over the top of the excavation where you went down. Before we start talking about what's down here, until this project was started in the 80s, what did the ground above this look like?
There was a small park with trees and grass. There was a monument standing in the middle. And in the 80s, we began wondering what's under our feet. And so they began doing exploratory excavation. And when they came to this park, they began to find older foundations. And with the historical information, they began to identify that we had all the stages of development from the 19th century way back to prehistoric times right here in one spot.
How difficult is it to do that kind of research? If I may digress here, I did a show from Flagstaff, Arizona last year, and I stood at the major intersection of what it was at one time Highway 66, get your kicks on Route 66, that went through there, and San Francisco Street. And they showed me a photograph taken from a point at which I was standing last year, and across this dirt road, which became Highway 66, were two little buildings, and behind it was a pine forest. That's where Flagstaff is now. But since Flagstaff was only started in the mid-late 1800s, it is photographically documented. You can see that first building and follow the evolution. What do you do when you go back to the 1700s, the 1600s? How do you, short of just picking around, is there documentation to know what is underground, and how sketchy is it?
Well, we're lucky because Montreal has a lot of information. Since it was a French colony, there's a lot of information still in France and in the National Archives here in Quebec in Canada, so that that's the first step actually. You search out your old maps, your old documents to get an idea, first of all, is there anything of interest that could possibly be here, so that this is a major initial step in archaeology, is to use your historical documents. Obviously for the prehistoric sites you have a lot less information, and in fact you do at times end up just walking through the woods, digging holes in the ground, hoping to find something.
One of the more unique things about this, and we can go back over here, is after you come into the entryway, where you actually see where the tiny second river came through, which was then culvertized or channelized, covered over the top, and then for most people disappeared. Here in the floor, and this is absolutely incredible, a space of about 6 by 6 feet, it is as if we're looking down through glass to a miniature. We are actually looking at this area now, done in little models, as if we were looking, let's say, from a hot air balloon in what, the 1600s?
Well, what we've done is, because it's hard to imagine what this site looked like back when the Indians were living here and the island was covered with trees, we have 5 models depicting these different passages of this looked like where the museum is standing in 1350. This is a carbon-14 date that we have for an Indian settlement on the island, and so we're standing over the glass of the model, looking right over top of an Indian camp that dates before the arrival of the Europeans in the 1500s.
Now you can see very graphically where this small river that is invisible in modern times merged with the St. Lawrence, and if we walk forward, you get a funny sense that you're going to fall in because you're walking over plate glass. Here we have the same identical place, and obviously the coming, as we would say, of the white man with European-looking buildings. We're talking now about what era?
This is 1700, when the French have established the colony, and we're having more and more buildings and a palisade, soldiers protecting the city from the dangers of the...
And we still have a little bit of the river, but it's much smaller than it was, and society is encroaching on it a little bit more.
Because of the flooding, they began channeling the river, building retaining walls, dredging it, etc. An interesting thing about these models that are in the floor, you can walk over them. Adults will stop at the edge. Children fling themselves down on the floor and are fascinated by these images of the past.
Well, my listeners know I broke my leg. See, I just stepped back. I only went down about 1/4 of an inch, and I was terrified all of a sudden. And then let's move forward a little bit. Here we have the same thing, and at this point the little river is still there, but there's been a major wall built here to fortify the city.
The history of Canada and the United States is linked, even when we're called French and British. So the city wall around Montreal was primarily to protect the interests of the French in Canada against the encroachment of the British, who in fact did end up attacking, and the French lost the colonies. Montreal itself was never attacked, but our walls did encircle the city, much like you see today in Quebec City.
Now here's something that you've been able to show graphically. It must have been intriguing for the person who built the models to actually construct the remnants of buildings that had burned.
A lot of times when people see this, they think these are ruins from this attack, but we explain, no, we were busy burning down our own city rather than having the enemy
Just
doing
what, all wood, hearth fires, the whole problems you had with society years ago?
The fact, too, that usually you have to heat about 8 months of the year with an open fire, candles, animals, of course, having straw and hay. So the French, very early on in the 18th century, brought in ordinances forbidding animals to be kept in the city, and you had to have firewalls, and the architecture, of course, was reflected these regulations trying to prevent fires.
The city of Montreal, Quebec, Canada, is doing all it can to show people just how it began as a tiny village back in the 1600s and even before that, with a wonderful museum of archaeology and history that allows people to go underground and see how the city actually began. Our tour guide is Virginia Elliott, and I continue my conversation with her. Now let's move forward. We're going now to about the year, this is a model of 1802. At this point, the little river is still there, but we're seeing a lot of larger buildings. And this looks like copper roofs, more of a stone and less flammable construction.
Right. Yeah, under the French, the buildings were built of stone, but the roofing was still cedar shingles or wood. And after the British arrived, by 1800, we see the city is opening up, and they have actually tin roofs. These are rusted tin roofs. Mm-hmm. And so they're trying more modern materials to prevent these fires. Over on the point where the little river is, we're now beginning to expand back over onto the point. And this is where we have the gentleman who built his outhouse into the cemetery.
Now, moving forward, here we are, and we've come up to where now? Late 1800s, almost a skyscraper here. At this point, the little river is completely invisible. It's been put underground in a channel or a culvert, and over the top of that river, someone built a building.
We have what we call today Old Montreal. So the Victorian period, 1870s, this is the golden era of Montreal. The architecture with the Industrial Revolution has really become sophisticated, and we have this Royal Insurance building built right over where the city had originally been founded. And it was right along the edge of where the river was and is now a street.
Well, now herein, I guess, lies the tale, as they say. You have this fledgling settlement right up against the river. It grows and grows. It begins to be a major city largely because of trade and furs. And then comes along a European society that says we can live here, build a huge city, and right over the top of the birthplace, the cradle of this city, someone builds a building. Was there any regard for history at that time, or did it just seem the right thing to do? Let's build.
I don't think people were aware really of what was underneath. Things disappear, especially wooden structures, and a cemetery is easy to forget once there's no headstones. So in that sense, perhaps two generations would know what was once there, but it becomes easily forgotten. And especially with the sense of archaeology. If we go to Egypt, yes, we know what archaeology is. Mm-hmm. But here in North America, primarily because of our climate, because of the way of life, we have to dig deeper, so to speak. And this is what we're trying to show to the people, that we do have archaeology here. Maybe they're not fancy pyramids, and we have something to show.
Now, just below us, across from this large insurance company office that was built over the top of the tiny river, in an area, and the wall surrounding the city is no longer there. By the late 1800s, that had been taken down.
Early 1800s.
But we see a square. Are we now underneath this? Is this where they found these ruins that have been preserved? I'm trying to put in perspective, because actually we're standing at the footing level of much of that early construction.
We're standing just outside the city walls, right by the market gate. So we're
is this stonework we see in front of us here the base of that old wall?
That's right. All the foundations, the archaeological sites have been left as they were found. They haven't been reconstructed. They haven't been moved here. They're basically left as the archaeologists uncovered it. So we're standing just outside the city, and we would take this street that you can see, the paved street, we would take to go up to the marketplace.
Well, let's walk over here now. There have been wonderful stairs put here so you can actually walk up onto the top of the wall. I guess in farm country we used to call this a stile, where you had steps on either side of a fence.
Well, we don't expect our visitors to be archaeologists. You don't have to be an athlete. We have facilities for wheelchairs, strollers, children.
This is incredible to describe on radio. We are standing in the middle of a variety of walls, some 4 to 5 feet thick. The original stone that was put here in the 1600s. When you started digging in this area, who came up with the idea of, hey, we need to cover this up and protect it from the weather, but fix it? You can walk right up here. I mean, it is as if I am the stonemason 300 and some years ago laying stone here. You're not supposed to touch things, but you can get so close to this. It's amazing.
That's one of the challenges of the museum. We want people to get this sensation. The first time I walked through the ruins of the insurance company, I knew it dated to 1861. That's not that old, but when you walk through the ruins, it's like walking through something that has existed in the past, and you get this feeling of another lifetime, and you really get this sense of our history and times gone by. And when the archaeologists began digging, you can imagine how frustrating it is. We spend our time exposing all these ruins, digging out the soil, and then winter comes, we have to fill the soil, the site back in to protect it, because the context, the position of where we're finding things is so important. The next spring we come back, we empty out the site, and we knew because of the climate that we couldn't just leave these stone walls, because they would disappear, they would be a mess in a few years. So it was the archaeologists themselves, as they would discover every year more and more, because the deeper you go, the older it gets, the more exciting it is. They thought, let's leave this exposed, let's show people where we've come from, what our past is. And this was the initial idea, to leave the site exposed. An interesting detail is the fact that we're standing underground is because we're in front of the customs house that is also part of the museum. It was built in 1838. And it greeted people as they came into the port. And in the past, of course, ships were the major mode of transportation. And this was the building that gave this prosperous look to the visitors and to people arriving in Montreal. And when the idea of the museum was initiated, Heritage Montreal was concerned that we protect this image. So rather than building up in front and hiding this old customs house, we've protected that view so that when you still come into the port of Montreal, you see the customs house, and we're standing underground.
It's almost like looking at a layer cake here, the way everything progressively goes upward. But yet here, in the midst of this stonework, we can see smaller brick, which is obviously from a later era, and then there's an old-fashioned 4-inch water main that runs through here that obviously is part of, what, the 1800s?
We don't expect our visitors to understand it all. It took us quite a bit to figure it all out, because it's not a chronological visit. You start out and you're in the 19th century, then you see something from the 17th century, so it does bounce around. So we encourage people to come back. We're quite happy to see them coming back again and again.
Now, one of the things I think would be really frustrating for an archaeologist and historian is the fact that sometimes you cannot slow down progress fast enough, that a building goes up and before you can get a court injunction, they've torn down something that will never be replaced. The archaeological site I went to in South Dakota at Vermilion last year is on a bluff. They are going to put an off-ramp for a bridge across the river there, and they can't stop that. So they're working at lightning speed, even in the worst weather out there, to try to find as much as they can. How did this project get started, the preservation aspect of this particular site, the original Montreal, and were there people at the time who said, hey, who cares, let's just read about it in books?
Well, I suppose there's some people who don't have a real love of archaeology, but the fact that they began digging here was because we began to do an inventory of what sites, what there was still preserved under our streets. And so parking lots, parks, any accessible area became subject to studies. And this is why they came here, to see what was there. And precisely to avoid this problem of you don't know what's there until it's too late. And when you have a $300 million project, it's pretty hard to say, gee, could we stop and dig for 3 months? So the whole administration of the City of Montreal with the provincial government has tried to set up a body of archaeologists who can prepare with these studies so that if a site is to be developed, we know already that there's a potential archaeological site of such and such degree that needs either 3 months or 3 weeks, etc. It's not foolproof. We sometimes make mistakes. We think we have a sort of a very disturbed site that really isn't worth studying, and then we discover in the middle of the project that, well, actually, no, we want to save this, and then you've got your contractors and projects. But there is a concerted effort to try and save as much as we can. But not everything can be saved. Sometimes we'll study the site, take the information, and then the site disappears.
I asked Virginia Elliott what even the smallest town could do to make sure its heritage is preserved before it's too late.
One of the most important roles of the museum is to familiarize people with the kind of archaeology you find in this part of the world. That we're not going to have these obvious pyramids. And in everybody's backyard, pretty much, you find some archaeology. I dug up a clay pipe when I was planting tulips last spring or last fall. And this is the factor that with the museum, we're hoping that people will begin to recognize what can be valuable. And it's not bringing the object to the archaeologist and saying, oh, gee, I found this really neat bottle. What can you tell me about it? It's bringing the archaeologist to the site, saying this is the context, this is the soil, and all these tests can be done and studies of where the thing is from, so that people can go to a historical society or to the local government saying, gee, I think I have something of interest, what do you think?
Actually moving it is the worst thing you can do.
Exactly, because you're trying to, it's almost like a homicide. You don't touch anything. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's ideally. And but if people can recognize what's a potential richness of their past, it might be only a barn that was built in 1820, but it can still hold a lot of information that's since been lost.
For example, in my hometown in Indiana, U.S. Highway 50, which is a major east-west highway in the United States, used to go through downtown years ago. Eventually, in the 1930s, it went through the south part of town, and as of 2 years ago, it doesn't even go through town anymore. There's a big bypass. But you can still, if you know where to look, see 3 houses that if you use your imagination, you can tell they used to be gas stations, because all of the traffic through central Indiana went through there until the 1930s, and there were gasoline stations. But I like that kind of archaeology, that you go back, maybe it's more recent history than that, but you trace an old highway, and you realize that something doesn't look right, and that's because there used to be a major road through there.
Well, when people start asking questions, that's usually what's going to instigate a study. If people want to protect sites or want the powers to be to invest in protecting and exploiting their past, the people have the power. And although you have to have a permit to officially do a dig, I would say anybody can be an archaeologist, because all life skills can be applied. Hauling dirt, a good eye, hands that can manipulate and identify pieces of the puzzle to reconstruct a plot. And this is what in Montreal we've had digs in the past where the public can participate. Earthwatch has projects where you can pay and contribute to the research project, and you actually participate and contribute a major amount of skill.
One final thing, as we walk over to this one area, I mentioned that you can reach out and touch the stone and imagine that you might, but you're not supposed to, that you might have been there in the 1600s. Here you've gone down so far that you can actually see wood which thousands of people walked on. It was a floor to something.
Well, I wouldn't say thousands. This was a guardhouse in the late 1600s.
It may have felt like thousands.
And Montreal only had a few hundred people at the time. But this is a floor that was built in 1689 and disappeared only in 1802. So several hundred people would have walked over this floor.
And it looks as if there's remnant that something had burned here.
One of the pillars, or one of the beams, is charred. You can see it's blackened. And when the archaeologists come across evidence like this, they've already done a preliminary study to be able to get an idea of what's here. And in fact, we have historical documentation talking about a fire that damaged the building in the 1700s.
I guess the thing that runs through your mind when you look at this and realize that we have gone down 10, 15 feet below what was a park at one time is that in going down, we've gone back, and you really can't hear the trot of boots across there, but it doesn't take much a stretch of the imagination to really realize that people lived here. And I guess that's the thing that you have to keep in mind, that we're dealing not with digging up objects, but we're digging up objects that would not have been there had people not been there.
Well, the whole point of archaeology is to better know the people who were here in the past. And by walking through the ruins and being able to say this stone was laid down in 1720, this was the floor the soldiers walked on in 1700, this is the sense that you get of actually being in the very spot, much as you would when you go to visit Roman amphitheaters. It's exactly the same feeling. And the fact that it belongs to us, that it's North American, that we can identify with it, it's not a foreign culture.
Well, Virginia Elliott, of the formal name, I can't say it in French, but if you want to find it, just ask in Montreal where the Archaeological Museum is. Is that close enough? Museum of Archaeology?
That's right. Calière is a difficult name even for French-speaking people to pronounce, but you actually met Mr. de Calière, who...
yes, some strange ghost-like figure walked up as we were going through on the tour. You do a marvelous job here, and I want to thank you for joining us this week.
Well, we hope to see lots of people. I must say we get a lot of American visitors, and they make us feel really good because they love the museum.
Before leaving Montreal, I was given a tour of the most beautiful building I've ever seen in my life, the Cathedral of Notre Dame. Lee LePage was my tour host.
This church was built starting in 1823. We hired an Irish architect, actually. His name was Mr. O'Donnell. And we asked him two things: a big church, because it was going to be the only parish church for the French Catholics of Montreal. And we asked him a Gothic church, because we had no Gothic construction at that time. So he came here to supervise. He settled here to supervise the construction, but then he died 6 years later. And then we buried him under the church, where he still is, actually. And then we hired a French-Canadian to finish the inside of the church. And Monsieur Bourgeot decided that the whole inside would be in wood, and most of it carved by hand. So that's what makes this church so special. It is in this church that Luciano Pavarotti recorded his Christmas concert that you see on TV every year. And we often have also concerts of the Symphonic Orchestra of Montreal.
I don't think I've ever seen anything this ornate in my life.
Well,
I mean, there's not a square inch of any space left here to do anything with as far as gilding or improving it. I mean, it is absolutely incredible.
And you notice the nice blue of the church too. It's called Notre Dame, and the first name of the city of, actually the colony, was Ville-Marie, which means City of Mary. In other words, the colony had been consecrated to the Virgin Mary. So it does explain this nice blue. If you notice the pulpit, it's placed in the center of the church because at that time we had no microphones, and it was very important that everybody could hear when the priest was talking. It's considered a masterpiece because look at the staircase twirling around.
Yeah, it's a serpentine staircase that goes up an entire story it's not quite a figure S, it twists and turns, and the woodwork is all continuous in it. It's just phenomenal.
All the golden decoration also is not paint. It's gold sheets, 22 karat gold. And if you turn around and you look completely at the back, you'll see the organ of the church. They're the most prestigious in Canada. It has more than 7,000 pipes. And if you come here tomorrow morning, you'll hear it, because Mass on Sundays, you also have the organ. So it's every hour on the hour. And High Mass is at 11, then you would also have the choir. We also have a chapel right behind, so maybe you would like to see it. We'll go and have a look. The original chapel was built in the last century in a style very similar to the big church, and it was for people who wanted to be quiet, because the big church was always very busy.
And so, the second of two visits to Montreal, Canada.
Je me souviens que sous le lys je naquis et sous la rose je grandis.
Lisa, thank you.
You're welcome.
Montreal, Canada, one city that is doing what it can to preserve its glorious past. I'm Dennis Daly.